Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 34th Annual Banff Midsummer Ball and to our Film and Media Spotlight, sponsored by Jones Day. I suspect that many of you had pretty much the same experience I had after watching Argo last year, when I sat back and thought, I wonder how much of that was fact and how much was fiction. Argo took home multiple awards for actor and filmmaker Ben Affleck, including, of course, both the Oscar and the Golden Globe Awards for Best Picture. But the film also generated its fair share of controversy. Argo tells the story of the rescue of 6 U.S. diplomats from Tehran during the 1979 Iran hostage crisis. For almost 3 months, all 6 of them were sheltered by staff at the Canadian Embassy. Ken Taylor was the Canadian ambassador to Iran at the time, and he and his wife, Pat, became heroes for coming to the aid of the Americans following the seizure of the U.S. Embassy, and ultimately for helping them to escape safely. In Argo, their role, and the role of other Canadian staff, is largely usurped by CIA agent Tony Mendez, played, of course, by Ben Affleck. And this is a Hollywood classic, where truth plays a supporting role to a compelling story with a big star. Today, we have an opportunity to sort fact from fiction and remember a dramatic and proud chapter in the history of Canadian and American diplomacy. The sponsor of our Film and Media Spotlight is law firm Jones Day. Banff Centre Governor and Jones Day partner Chris Hilbert is with us to introduce our speakers. Please join me in welcoming Chris.
Well, this is a great privilege for us to be here to sponsor this, to be with these 3 remarkable people. And I'm going to give you just some highlights of their careers, but nothing can do justice to how rich their careers are, so these really are just a few highlights. First, Pamela Wallin, Senator Wallin, a legendary journalist, broadcaster, interviewer. I've met each of these 3 over the last 10, 12 years in New York. I'm in New York, and I've seen Pamela Wallin on film. I've seen her in public situations, and I've seen her one-on-one, and her interview art is truly great art. She is a superb interviewer, bringing out the best in people and the most interesting comments. She was Consul General to New York. She came down with Prime Minister Chrétien in the beginning of December of 2001 as 10, 12,000, 20,000 Canadians descended on New York to show the bond that Canada has with New York. And she stayed as Consul General and did a superb job connecting Canadian business people, academicians, artists, professionals, diplomats with the counterparts in the 2 countries. And of course, she's now a distinguished senator and serves on various boards and is also consulting with various companies. Pat Taylor, Dr. Patricia Taylor, is a renowned bacteriologist, microbiologist. She has done some serious studies over the years as part of groups and leading groups into hepatitis, into West Nile, into AIDS. She recently stepped down from the New York Blood Bank, and she's worked around the world on this. And true to the theory of Banff, which tries to connect different disciplines, not only is she a renowned scientist, but she has danced in ballet professionally. She's performed on the stage professionally as a violinist, quite a Renaissance woman. And the same way we call Pamela Wallin also Senator Wallin, and we call Pat Taylor Dr. Taylor, we don't just call Ken Taylor Ambassador Taylor. Many of us know him as his real name, James Bond. Obviously a distinguished diplomat. He'll get to what happened in Tehran with Pamela and Pat. Just note that during the promotion of the Argo movie, President Jimmy Carter from the United States, former President Jimmy Carter, stated, just to set the record straight, that the protection and the removal of the 6 Americans was 90% Canada, Ken Taylor. He also served as Consul General in New York. He was part of the senior management of RJR Nabisco in the States. He was a member of the Banff Centre board. He introduced me to the Banff Centre, and he serves on various boards and as a consultant. Now, just one little note, I know you want to get to them, but in New York, we have some 8 million people living in New York City, and we have thousands and hundreds of thousands of tourists and diplomats and business people and artists and people from universities coming through. And you in Canada are very lucky to have these three individuals, because not only are they smart, creative, witty, well-read, they're much more well-read than I and most anybody I know is, but they're also very sensitive, caring people on an individual basis and as far as groups of people. And this, you can see this in the way Ken handled the whole Argo saga in his dealings with Ben Affleck. So I just want to thank you for giving me the honor to introduce you three. Thank you.
Chris really is a great friend of Canada, and shared many long hours where I would phone him and say, you have to show up at this event, you have to come to dinner, and he was always there. And it's wonderful to have friends like you in the United States, and friends like Ken and Pat. When I arrived in New York, were so generous and introduced me to this most amazing city, where Ken and Pat are still the toast of the town. As Canadian Consul General in New York, I attended at least a half a dozen events a year, thanking Ken and Pat, celebrating what they had done for our American cousins. And it was a wonderful introduction, and I learned a lot watching them and borrowing Ken's cachet at often full restaurants in New York. When I needed to take someone out to dinner, I would phone Ken and say, "Can I borrow your name?" Yes, he'd say. And I'd swan into the restaurant and say things like, "Ambassador Taylor said that I would really enjoy this restaurant." And they'd say, "Well, why don't I take you to Ambassador Taylor's table?" And that would be great. So it does say something about the relationship between the two countries, as Chris noted what President Carter had said, 90% Canada, 10% the US. So tonight we really will try and take a little look at Hollywood versus history, because there are two very different versions of what went on. Even though Argo was a great movie and I enjoyed it thoroughly, it just doesn't necessarily reflect exactly what happened. So Ken and Pat, just before we begin and get into this story, I do want you to have, I want to have you both kind of set the stage. You were a young diplomatic couple. You had a young son. You weren't that experienced in world affairs, and here you land up in a situation that nobody could have predicted. You were kind of going to a very interesting place, but not one you thought would be in the middle of a revolution.
Yeah. Well, as the revolution unfolded, I looked for a guidebook, how a diplomat acts and presents himself or herself during a revolution. And there was nothing in the library. But certainly when I went to Tehran in 1977, you remember the Shah, the grandeur of the Shah. He even had the audacity to bid for Pan American Airlines, which really hit the U.S. psyche, quite apart from the oil flow. Canada was a good friend of Iran. The Shah and Prime Minister Trudeau were about the same age. They'd exchanged visits very successfully with a good feeling. Oil was going back and forth. Canadian engineering skills were used. Certainly a number of engineers from Calgary I'd see. At that time, Home Oil, some of you remember, were a player in Tehran. And then, to everyone's surprise, I think everyone's surprise, at least most people's surprise, the revolution unfolded. The Ayatollah Khomeini found himself from Iraq to Paris to Tehran. After he arrived, I talked to one of his aides, secular aides, and I said, "Things aren't going too well in terms of organizing the government. I know you're trying hard, but what happened?" He said, "Well, we thought we'd be in Paris for 5 years. We never anticipated that the Shah's regime would collapse with the rapidity it did. So what started out, Pam, in your question, an innocent posting, very intriguing posting, one I was very privileged to have, turned out into be something that certainly Ben Affleck had a lot of fun with.
And Pat, you were not the traditional diplomatic wife. You were, as Chris has laid out, a very well-respected researcher in the field of medicine in general, but you went to work at the blood transfusion center in Tehran. You were a working scientist.
Well, Pamela, everyone views the diplomatic life as one of privilege and glamour. So, of course, even though I was working at the time, when Ken asked me to marry, I said yes, because he promised me these grand houses of well-appointed, enough household staff to cater to my every need, fascinating and interesting cultural exchanges, a chance to meet and converse with people who were the rulers of the world, people who were in high places. And of course, I said yes, willing to give up everything. So what happened? The first night in Guatemala, we stayed in a wooden hut with soil on the floor and cockroaches going up and down the walls. Then we went to Detroit, where they had demonstrations just before the race riots. And after that, he said, it'll be fine, don't worry. So we went to Pakistan, demonstrations before partition. And from Pakistan, we went to England. And I thought, oh, Twiggy and the Beatles. But what did we have? Kidnappings and post-box bombings. And to top it all, we ended up in Iran with a revolution. So I had to do something to get over my...
To get out of the house.
That's right.
He's quite a charmer to con you into all of that, wasn't he?
Yes, he really was. So that's how I ended up working at the blood transfusion.
But that did really integrate you into the society.
Yes. Oh, yes, it did. And it was a level of society that I think was quite different from the people that Ken would meet. Because these were all scientists are really middle class. They're not in the media or in the diplomatic level. They're middle class. And it was very interesting because these people were apolitical, and the revolution was as disturbing to them as it was to us. But as a foreigner, I always felt that there are problems in Tehran or in Iran that I really wasn't privileged to, and it was really an internal, personal sort of fight that they were having.
Ken, just tell us a little bit about how this unfolded in terms of the events of the revolution in general, but then how you ended up harboring American diplomats themselves.
Well, the Shah was ill. That was a start, and not many people were aware of that. He was seriously ill, but somehow managed to keep it a secret between his own closest members of the family and his physician from Paris. Then also he began, as you could see, almost lose confidence in himself. As the mobs grew stronger, they were more vocal, and there was some suggestion that the military, almost 600,000 of them who were behind the Shah for many years, were beginning to question their loyalty and were becoming reluctant to shoot their own citizens. When he did leave, it was a sorry day for the family, but also there was still maybe 20 to 30%, 20% of the Iranian population who were still pro-Shah, weren't caught up in the revolution. Khomeini arrived, and then there was a rivalry between four parties as who would reign supreme. Khomeini, an astute politician, as well as being an Ayatollah. Maybe they're one and the same. Saw his way through and became the supreme lawyer. And that introduced a new faith, a new system of government, which is still being tested. That is a theological republic, which is a rather contradiction in terms. But overnight, the country changed. The revolution went on. There were scores to be settled. Every day in the newspaper, there were pictures of those shot at 1 o'clock in the morning for being corrupt against God. For some of them, the case was pretty flimsy. There was no jury. It was largely the Ayatollahs who decided who was going to pay for the corruption that they saw that was there during the time of the Shah. At the early stages when I was there were roughly 90 embassies. Everybody looking for a bit of the petrodollar. Everybody competing for the Shah's attention. By the time the Khomeini entered into his first or second month, there were maybe 25 embassies left. There was really very little in the way of a compelling reason to stay. The society changed, the radio programs changed, the discotheques closed, good wine were poured down the cellars. It was some tragic days, quite apart from the true tragedy of the Iranians.
Some of it went to the Taylor residence. They used it later.
But it happened in a sense, as I said earlier, by surprise, and it happened, really, the revolution was over. The victory, the Ayatollah saw victory after 6 months, although, in a sense, if you look at Iran today, you could say, well, maybe, in an essence, the revolution is still going on.
So there was a storming of the U.S. Embassy, and these 6 folks worked in a part of the building where they could physically get out.
Yeah, the diplomacy after the Khomeini arrived, the Ayatollah wasn't necessarily as practiced under the Vienna Convention. I ran into the Egyptian ambassador one day on the street, and he said, "I'm leaving." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, I've been designated as persona non grata." And I said, "Oh, what happened? Did you go to the foreign ministry and they told you?" He said, "No, I heard it over the radio." Yeah. So, protocol, anything else, a sense of diplomatic community didn't exist. The Iranians themselves were diffident. The embassies weren't necessarily threatened except with respect to the British and, of course, the U.S. on Valentine's Day, February. Taken over again on November 4th, the supposition being that after 3 days, the embassy would be, one way or the other, the U.S. diplomats would be liberated, and that would be it. However, as we know, 444 days later, on the very day that President Reagan was installed and inaugurated, the U.S. diplomats were to leave. 5 diplomats worked in the consular section, which visas, passports, and was separate. The embassy was stormed. They decided to leave by the front door and seek refuge. 6 of them turned right. They were apprehended. 5 of them turned left. They then went to house. They went to some embassies looking for a place to stay. They phoned John Sheardown, my colleague, who suggested to them that we may be able to help, certainly. That in turn, he talked to me. I sent a message to both Joe Clark, Prime Minister, and Flora MacDonald, Foreign Minister, who replied almost simultaneously. Prime Minister Clark did not contemplate what political risk am I taking. I think his instincts were the same as those of us at the embassy. That is, this is a Canadian response to U.S. diplomats who were innocent and had no other sanctuary, and without one way or the other coming to their assistance would have found themselves in jeopardy at the compound.
I find this an amazing part of the story because there wasn't much of it even in the immediate aftermath. But you're quite right. This was a huge risk for Canada. The repercussions could have been much more serious than they were. It was a daring act in many ways, but you both felt very supported and 100%, even though they were heading into an election. I mean, this was a complicated time.
No, it was something that the Canadians in the embassy felt strongly about.
Yeah.
And when I came back, Pat and I came back, and my colleagues as well, of course it was in the middle of the election. You may recall that, the election, Prime Minister Clark and former Prime Minister Trudeau. And so I found myself in a sort of a little mini hurricane. Prime Minister Clark did not make it an election issue. He respected what had been done, but he didn't dwell on it. He kept to the issues that were in front of the public at that time. I was asked to speak, was not entirely, as you know, diplomats are nonpartisan.
And reticent.
At least verbally. That you all have your own political views, but you don't necessarily express them if
Right.
you're there. So I eventually, it was suggested that maybe we go to France for 2 weeks, disappear. Which, of course, with no great reluctance, we took the opportunity.
Exactly.
So that was the really the odd period. It was evolved eventually, as you say, into a movie.
All right, Pat, you were going, I mean, obviously you're consulted on this. Your husband says not only promising you dirt floors and cockroaches, but now says, I'm going to put our entire family life in jeopardy, and I'm bringing U.S. diplomats into our house. We could be stormed at any time. We could be killed for doing this, assassinated really quite literally. Was your response the same? This is what we should do?
Risk taking was not ever discussed or a part of any of the decisions. Ken called me at work one day and said, "Oh, we have visitors, a couple of visitors." He didn't say the time, but I accepted it because in embassies you get people who come and go, as you know, in the consulate.
well know.
Especially if you're in a part that's very
Right.
very picturesque. And so when I arrived home, we had dinner together and everything seemed normal. After a week, it got a little suspicious. And then after a month, I thought, daily rates just won't cut this. It'll have to change to monthly. So we knew that they were being sought after by the revolution. Well, not sought after because the revolutionaries didn't know about them specifically.
At that moment,
That's
yeah.
right. But we knew they were in jeopardy. And as I said, it was just a thing you did. You didn't think about it. You didn't think about the risks or what might happen to your family. Although at work, it was indirect. I did get a note, an anonymous note one day, just stating that they knew Ken was ambassador and that we had one son who was going to be harmed if I didn't leave the country. But they didn't know about the people staying in the house. Right. Anyway, my colleagues rallied to the challenge, and they actually went all over the blood transfusion centre and identified the particular typewriter that the letter was typed on. And the director called me in and said, "Look, Pat, don't worry. This is a disgruntled nurse who has written this sort of letter before, and even though she also threatens that she's going to blow up the blood centre, we'll take that
Right.
with a grain of salt, and we'll look after you, so don't worry about it."
That's an amazing situation. Ken, you had to start, obviously, to think almost immediately about getting them home, about exfiltration, as the formal word is. What was going through your head? What did you think was going to happen or could happen? What would be logical?
Yeah, I'd never heard of the word exfiltration before.
Yeah.
In any event, we made our own definition of it. But no, we thought, well, how are these 6 diplomats are fine, but they want to get home. They want to. They're in danger here. Who knows when their colleagues, 50-odd some in the U.S. Embassy, will ever get home,
Right.
or if they'll be put on trial, what have you. We came up with some scenarios, and it's marvelous. As any of you sitting here, if you were said, well, how are they going to get home? You'd come up with some marvelous ideas, some more imaginative than feasible. But again, that's what we did. We exchanged these views with Ottawa. Ottawa liked some, they didn't like others. But the very point is we couldn't do this unilaterally. They were U.S. diplomats. Our own concern was the 6 diplomats, but just as equally the Canadian staff in the embassy, who were in certainly a degree of jeopardy. So we kept pushing Ottawa, and Ottawa kept pushing Washington. Eventually, Flora MacDonald, at that time foreign minister, was in a NATO meeting with Cyrus Vance and said, you've got to turn your attention to the 6, because in Washington they said they're safe with the Canadians. Right. It's the 50 some odd that we need to focus on, which is understandable. Yeah. Facetiously, Flora MacDonald said, if they don't come up with something, we're going to set them out on bicycles. The wizards in Hollywood thought she was serious. So in the movie, that was the first scenario. They're going to go out on bicycles. The proposals were gone over, and then in the middle of things, we got a note a month and a half after that Jean Pelletier, some of you may know, he was the La Presse correspondent in Washington, had the story in essence, he thought. He went to the Canadian Embassy, his publisher went to Ottawa, and they said, you've more or less got it right, but you essentially put a death sentence on these people if you go with the story. To the credit of the press, which I think is, of course, maybe with good grounds, frequently criticized, maligned, the media, they said, we'll hold the story. We had the message. We wondered, what if the story does break? Yeah. If La Presse has it, probably the New York Times or the Globe has it or something. We came up with the idea, we'll rent a villa down the street. The villas in Tehran have a 12-foot wall, 3 blocks away. And so I got my friend, the New Zealand ambassador. We gave him $25,000 and said, go down and pretend, whoever you are, rent a villa. So he went down and saw the Iranian landlord and said, I'm in cement. I'm a contractor. I've come from New Zealand. I'm bringing people back. He was astounded. Best news he'd had in months. Right. He says, I need your villa for 3 months. Cash. So we rented the villa in the sense that if we heard that the press had broken, that the press story had broken, we could easily move the 6 diplomats from our houses into the one down the street.
But not to say they wouldn't have stormed your place, guns a-blazing.
But there would have been, we would have been casually having a drink before dinner.
Yes, that's right, as the movie would have it.
Yeah.
A couple of things on that score. I mean, the taking this on, I mean, you really did have to get the American attention and say, we know you're worried about the others, but look, we need to focus on this. It meant Canada had to take some fundamental decisions about whether we would stretch our own laws in order to do it. And all of this, trying to communicate this stuff with the pressures of time in a day when there was no internet and no email and no cell phones, and you did have to communicate plans, ideas, thoughts, and try not to give away the shop in case these were intercepted.
Well, a bit facetiously, the lack of communication, modern communication, in a sense, in retrospect, may have been a good thing. Yeah. Because then you had no micromanagement from Ottawa. Now, it's a terrible thing to say about anybody who's worked in Ottawa, but we all know how big organizations work. And whereas our only means of communication, secure communications, was through our cipher machine, which, again, today would be quite antiquated, but those days it was a machine about the size of a ping pong table. and the code was the Iranians had no opportunity to break it. So the telephones didn't work. There was no, there was sort of a fax machine, again, an old archaic vehicle, but communications worked very well. It's hard to believe that maybe today, but there were no interruptions, everything smooth through. And I must say the response in Ottawa during all this time, although a certain amount of so much recognition came to those of us in Canada, in Tehran. In Ottawa, they moved mountains. The Prime Minister and Flora MacDonald, Ambassador Alan Gottlieb, who was Under Secretary, Michael Shenstone, head of the Middle East. They rushed through order and councils surreptitiously without the rest of the cabinet, federal cabinet, knowing. They forged papers. They broke the law almost every day.
Exactly.
And did it with dispatch, and gave the U.S. as a partner the opportunity to work with us to pursue one way of a road to freedom.
I want to do that, but speaking of breaking the law, and I carry this book around, it's called Our Man in Tehran, Ken Taylor, the CIA and the Iran hostage crisis. It's really the best take, and I hope you have sent Ben a copy of that book. But one of the things he says in there, one of the quotes in the book is great, and he quotes Sir Henry Wotton's aphorism that an ambassador is an honest man who lies abroad for the good of his country. The headlines out of this book were that Ken Taylor was an American spy, which you were.
Well, I gave them some intelligence.
But,
Pat?
yes, I've been asked that question
Yep.
many times. But when you think of it, it wasn't actually spying for the United States.
No.
It was providing intelligence to Canada, who then passed it on to the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador,
Right.
who then passed it on to the authorities in the United States.
Right.
So it wasn't a direct...
You were intelligence gathering.
That's right.
The basis for the intelligence gathering was that the United States decided to initiate a commando raid
Right.
to see if that would be a means of exfiltrating surgically somehow the 50-odd U.S. diplomats.
And Ross Perot had done this as a private citizen in some earlier...
After a fashion,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So they designated the initiative as Eagle Claw.
Yeah.
But since the U.S. had no intelligence, no CIA officers, no military undercover, nobody, if it can be imagined, with the budget, with the U.S. capabilities intelligent, of no way to gather information. They then proposed, I think it was President Carter to Prime Minister Clark, that would the Canadian Embassy fulfill this function? And that was, we agreed. And a military sergeant, Jim Edwards, who finished his career as Director of Security at the Calgary Airport, was a military police officer there.
Yeah.
And he undertook that, and then the U.S. asked if they could station a U.S. intelligence officer from the CIA in the Canadian Embassy as an officer. His name was Bob. I never got his last name.
Funny that.
And so that, as Pamela started out today, she said, well, it's an image of James Bond. However, if you reflect a bit, I'm thinking that maybe I'd be better personified as Austin Powers. At that time, horn-rimmed glasses, sort of...
The hair, the glasses.
The hair, glasses, the ineptness.
And the little wife.
Everything associated with Dr. Evil and Austin Powers. So it's not quite as glamorous as it seems. But the one moment, Jim Edwards was a remarkable Canadian. He'd go out every day do surveillance of the U.S. Embassy, try to determine how many people were inside, what sort of food was going into it, what sort of armaments they had, surreptitiously. All this done, and then he'd come back to the embassy, as would Bob, doing the same thing. This information, as Pat said, would go to Ottawa, then to the U.S. One day, one of his colleagues, a military police officer at the embassy, got a call at 10 o'clock from Jim saying, I'm inside the U.S. Embassy, but I've been apprehended. And we thought about that, which meant that the whole effort, not only with the six, but the status of the Canadian Embassy, which could be exposed as essentially putting together intelligence for breaching around sovereignty under cover of a so-called neutral embassy. If Jim was being interrogated, and if the interrogation, one way or the other, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Jim did make it out. The story he tells is that he was with an Iranian friend. They apprehended him outside. What are you doing? He said, I'm looking at the graffiti on the walls of the U.S. Embassy to determine if there is a secret, if this can be some clue as to what the Iranian Revolution is about. They weren't convinced. He was taken in, surrounded, asked what happens, largely in Farsi, some English, but he said to his friend, his girlfriend, tell me if I'm in trouble. About an hour later, she said, you're in trouble. Miraculously, he talked his way out.
Yeah.
And he came back to the embassy about 2 in the morning, and we were, needless to say, the understatement of the day, we were glad to see him. He said, well, he said, it won't happen again. He said, I'm going to be more careful tomorrow, and I won't do that thing. I said, Jim, there's no tomorrow. Here's the ticket to Tokyo.
Yeah.
So he left after a marvelous display of audacity. And
then these plans all started to, I mean, there was the raid, the commando raid to go in and storm the U.S. Embassy and try to free everyone that way. You were conjuring up these stories that this group of 6 were teachers looking to teach in the country, or they were agronomists from the University of Guelph studying agricultural
your former university.
Policies, even though it was the middle of winter. And then the Hollywood version of the Hollywood version, Tony Mendez was called in. He was the guy in charge of this for the CIA, of when they needed to get people out of anywhere. He was the guy that invented the cover stories, and he was really keen on this. They were all Hollywood producers or filmmakers.
Yeah, it was at about 2 months into the whole episode, the U.S. did decide that they'd become involved. Before this, it had been decided that all of a sudden these U.S. diplomats would become bona fide Canadians.
Right.
So
we would break the law and give them passports.
Yeah, give them a new dictionary and what have you. The work was done in Ottawa.
Yeah.
And now, if you recall, maybe the CIA Senator Church, sometime in the 70s, early 80s, reestablished ground rules for the CIA, which were very restrictive, particularly as opposed to now. And because of that, they could not essentially drop fictitious documents. To become Canadians, they needed a passport, which we talked about. But they needed driver's license, they needed university graduation certificates, they needed a little black book.
The backstory.
They need whatever is in their wallet. Yeah. And that was, of course, all done in Ottawa.
Yeah.
Tony Mendez came up to Ottawa and worked very well with the Canadians. It was a good relationship. And then eventually, a day and a half before the departure of the 6, he arrived in Tehran. So that which leads into the movie, which essentially asks the thing, but Hollywood, I don't think we ever thought, is about necessarily history. It's it's about entertainment.
That's right.
And when, as eventually it unfolded, Pat and I were asked to go to Hollywood, and Ben Affleck, we saw the movie, and you recall, those of you who saw it, the tension was built up. I was looking at this movie and thought, gee, this is pretty exciting. I wish I would have been there.
And how does it end?
And then this is it. And I can see Pat getting more and more apprehensive. And so finally, about 3/4 of the way through, she leans over and I said, "What?" She said, "We did get out okay, did we?"
The chase down the tarmac.
So, I mean, this is the power of
Yes.
Hollywood. It's an adventure ride, and it certainly caught the public's imagination. Here it is, as the byline said, based on a true story. I was wondering if it would have said based very loosely
Yes,
on
very
a
loosely.
true story.
One of the things that I think troubled Canadians was just part of the way you were depicted, that somehow you were passive hosts, that these people accidentally dropped in and you cooked dinner and lent them a sweater and poured them a glass of wine.
Yeah, and Pat apparently was incapable of getting past one sentence.
Yes, that's
But,
right.
Somebody in the background, but the movie itself served a purpose for certainly the U.S. public in a sense, in that it happened the same time as almost unfolded the same time as the tragedy in Benghazi,
Right.
and it served to convey to the U.S. public, particularly, or other Western countries, that the nature of work that diplomats in a dangerous neighborhood undertake, that this is particularly the life that a U.S. diplomat particularly lives. And if you look at the saga, read the story of Benghazi, it's quite apart from what I see as the mischievous and rather debate that's going on in Washington among the senators, which is primarily based, I think, on political points. Whereas the true story is the diplomats plus the special forces plus the other officers at a U.S. embassy doing their best under particularly precarious situations to carry out and establish a relationship with that country on behalf of the U.S. It's the movie in that sense conveyed that even 33 years after that this can still happen. But during this time, unbeknownst to me, Pat had quite prepared for any circumstance. She did with your hostage kit.
You had a kit?
Yes.
What was in it?
It was a big bag, somewhat like yours, only bigger. And it had a nice change of underwear, my toothbrush,
Yeah.
some medication that I was taking, and a little note saying if anything happens,
Right. I want Pat to tell this one story because you were there working at the blood transfusion center. You weren't getting paid.
Oh,
People
yes.
weren't getting paychecks.
Oh.
And then you had kind of given them a heads up that you might be leaving at some point. They were very supportive of you. And they managed, no one else was getting paid, and they managed to come up and provide you with a check to kind of settle up the account, which really wasn't of much use. But just tell that story.
Well, there were two places that I was working at, the transfusion service
Yeah.
and the Pasteur Institute.
Yes.
The transfusion, and for about 6 months, they hadn't paid me. So the transfusion service came up with a check and gave me, which I was able to change into real money.
Yeah.
But the Pasteur Institute gave me a check on the last day I was there, and all the banks had closed. Now, we all sort of
You were
from...
literally going to leave the next day.
Yes, that's right. And from the movie and from the news that we read about Iran today, we all have this, I think, it's not misguided, because there are elements there that are very fanatic. But we tend to think of Iran as a really bad place and the people just all fanatic and can't be counted on. But I found the exact opposite, because I had extremely kind and very caring colleagues. And this check that I was given from the Pasteur Institute for 6 months wouldn't have been worth anything, because I wasn't going to be able to change it. But that evening, when I went into the locker room to change into my street clothes, everybody, all of my colleagues, had their wallets out, and they were counting out the change that they had in the wallets, and eventually were able to give me the amount of money that the check had stated. So the girl who was in charge came up and said, "Look, this is for your check, and we'll take the check and change it during the week when we have a chance."
And you don't know whether they ever had?
No, I don't know whether they were able to change it and what might have happened if they went to change it,
Right.
because by then we were already in France and on our way back
And
to
that
Canada.
money was also used to buy some backup tickets.
Yeah,
for
that
the-
was great news. Pat came back to the embassy on her way home, said, "Oh, I got my back pay."
Hand it
Good.
over.
I said, "How much?" She said, 20,000. I said, "Great," because I said, "We need to," this was 3 weeks before the U.S. diplomats were to leave. I said, "I need to buy airline tickets, alternative airline tickets on British Airways, Swiss Airways, and SAS. And we would get cash through the diplomatic bag each week in Tehran, because there were no banks, which we did. And I said, "I'm running short, but this $20,000 is going to become very handy." So Pat said, "Well, $20,000 is for a good cause." Pat claims I never paid her back.
Did you get it back? Not Pat, I mean,
He claims he did.
it is a wonderful story. And I was just talking to an American friend the other day who'd gone to see the movie, of course, and was thrilled that it won the Oscar and all of that. And she said even though she knew what had happened, she actually sat in the movie theater and wondered whether people got out or not. And of course, we do know the story there. But you say and have said on other occasions that, of course, there wasn't that drama. There was the fear, obviously, but not the drama.
Yeah, I think the drama came from the tension, from what have you. But looking back at the movie, with the exception of the structure, that is 6 U.S. diplomats stayed with Canadians, really there wasn't anything
factual
in reality that passed for reality. And some people were quite dismayed, because maybe some of you saw the movie. A number of movie viewers became quite attached to our purported maid.
Right.
And they said, "Do you ever hear from her?" And I really had to taste Pat, because I usually ask Pat. And Pat's very reluctant to say, "Well, she never existed in the first place."
It was all those things he promised you.
I know.
Yeah.
But we had all male
Yes.
staff
Right.
who were there,
Yeah.
who were often curious about the...
Your extended
Oh,
visitors.
sure.
But they were fine?
Oh, well, yes, but they didn't hesitate to ask questions.
Right.
Madam, you said that they were coming here and they were interested to find out about the countryside and our tourist attractions, and they haven't stepped outside. I've offered them day after day. And so you just look people in the eye and say, well, you know, they're very tired. They
Yes.
have done some traveling before and they've come and they just want to rest.
Go ahead with your question.
Is it true? Is there any truth to the suggestion that some of these Americans went to other embassies and were turned away? I think the British, the Australians. I'm not sure even who was
At the
depicted as
beginning,
doing that. That's one question. And the other question is, if I heard you right, you said 5 of the people who escaped turned one way and ended up with you, and 6 turned the other way and got arrested. But there were 6 people, you said. So you've got a 5-story and a 6-story, and I'm just wondering, where did the extra one come from? And then I'm also wondering about what role John Sheardon played, because back in Ottawa, there's some sense that he hasn't gotten sufficient credit for whatever role he played. So I think that's 3 questions. Good.
With respect to the first question, is the British Embassy had been under siege on occasion. They eventually went to the British Embassy, and the British Embassy overnight, I guess in London, decided that it really wasn't going to work. And so they said, you'll have to move on. With respect to the second question, it was a detail, and I didn't know, Susan, you got the essence of it, but I didn't get into it because I've sort of glossed over it. What happened is 5 people were in the consular section. They got out through the door and weren't apprehended. One agricultural attaché was at the Swedish embassy exchanging notes, exchanging views. He could see from the window of the Swedish embassy that the US embassy was being taken over. He said to them, well, I'm not going back there. Can I stay here? Good judgment. 2 weeks later, I get a call from the Swedish ambassador. Said, do you mind coming over, dropping over? I said, sure, it's okay. Changed notes. He said, well, I've got a problem. I said, what's that? He said, well, a US diplomat happened to be in our office at the time of the takeover, and he's been with us 2 weeks, and we just can't keep him any longer. And he said, and you know, Canadians, they look like Americans, they act like Americans. Would you mind giving him sanctuary? I said, yeah, that's no problem. We already have 5. It's fine. The third question is John Sheardon. Certainly, John and Zina spent almost 3 months with 4 diplomats with them. Pat and I only had 2. John also was the one who took the first call. As things worked out, John and Zina left 3 weeks before the US diplomats left because we were cutting back the staff. And I think although there's been an effort to talk about John, he certainly didn't receive certainly the credit or the publicity that in a way I did.
Part of you should just mention this, though, that part of the reason for, of course, you were downsizing and sending people out for safety, but they were also collecting information as they went through the airport that would be useful for the exit of
we were sending people out to get intelligence. But John also carried out his immigration and consular work, which was very pertinent at the time. And John and Zina were very much part of the effort. But I think the observation is very true. They certainly didn't deserve publicly the credit they deserved.
Any regrets that you signed up for the adventure? Do you have any regrets that you signed up?
Oh, for Iran.
That you said yes?
Oh.
No,
Well, no, it turned out okay. I mean, I still have a lot of education for Ken. We've been married for, I don't know, more than 50 years, 53 years, and I still have a lot of work to do with him, so
you're
I'm not sorry.
Lots of training. It's absolutely true. One of the things that says everything that you need to know about Pat and Ken is during all of this kerfuffle about the movie and the opportunity to meet with Ben Affleck, Ken and Pat never said, change the movie, make us the star. They asked that at the end of the movie there be some words on the screen thanking the Canadian people. And Ben Affleck did that. But that's what this couple asked for. Not a moment in the sun for themselves, but for the country that they love and have represented so well. Thank you.